Hi guys, listen, I'm jumping on. This is just an extra little case because sometimes I read something in the press and it distresses me to a point where I need to share it. And this is a case that I need to share. I'm going to tell you now, it's unbelievably distressing. I think for any of you new parents out there, it is going to be one that takes your breath away. And I don't know, you're going to imagine a few things that you might like to do to the perpetrator in this particular case. I have a little girl who is just 21 months old. Understandably, I am really engaged in her protection, like you all are with your own kids. But I think when you've had a child in recent times, you're just so connected to their protection. I mean, we always are for the rest of our lives, whether your kid's 6 or 60, you just want to make them safe. But there is something about the protective mechanism and the love that you feel for that child where you know that you would lie down in front of a train and allow yourself to be ran over if it meant that their life would be positive and that they were protected. That's how we feel. And for the average human being, you don't need to have ever had a child to know what you would do to protect them. A stranger will stand in front of a moving vehicle to protect a child that they do not know. It is just the way that typical adjusted humans will act because we protect the most vulnerable. For those of you who are new to my channel, by the way, I release usually my content here twice weekly, but today I'm doing an extra one because I've just been so moved by this particular case. If you do like my content, please give me a like. If you haven't subscribed, why don't you? Get your notifications on. You'll never miss an episode because I am throwing these extra ones in, along with a lot of extra content behind my YouTube membership and my Patreon. Like I said, strap in for this one because it is truly horrific. So let me take you back to June 2023. This is when the case begins, and it involves a South African man named Hugo Ferreira. He's 37. Now, in the initial reports that I've read about, he's accused of doing the most heinous thing to his newborn baby. He later admits to this. The crime takes place in the one place a child should feel safe, which is in the family home. Now, bear in mind, we're not going to blame the mother, Maureen Brand, in this case whatsoever because she was not around when this crime played out and she could not have imagined the violence that was going to ensue when she left the father of her child in charge of the newborn baby. So this is one of those cases that makes you question everything about humanity. To call this man an animal does not go far enough. It's not fair. Because animals are predators usually for reason and purpose, and most animals are not harmful in any way. But we use that term because of the animalistic primal sense within some individuals to be predatory, and this individual fits it perfectly. So the crime takes place 8th of June 2023. It's in a neighborhood near Pretoria in South Africa. This is where Hugo Ferreira lives. Apparently, they live in a room in a space that is quite economically poor. It's a challenging environment economically across the landscape there. So there will be economic struggles, and we can all identify that when you've got economic struggles, obviously you're going to be more stressed, and stress is definitely a motivator of violent behaviour. Add to that the man in this case, who's the perpetrator, Hugo Ferreira, is also somebody who uses drugs, and we have a real cooking pot of possibility. And so even though the mother is out, and we're not going to blame her at all for the crime, I do think that it is really remiss of any parent to leave a child in the care of somebody who takes drugs, genuinely. And I don't care what drug it is, at the end of the day, you are in a situation where your eye is not on the ball. But that's what happens. She goes out, she's got to do some shopping trips, she's got to make some money by selling some items, and so she leaves her partner with their newborn daughter. So this child is 1 week old. Just imagine that. Conceive of what a 1 week old baby requires. They require feeding, they require changing, they require burping, they require sleeping. They give you some very clear messages. Usually the cries indicate a need. They're not just doing it for fun. They're not doing it to upset you. And yes, it is highly stressful when a baby is screaming because you want to sort it out. That's what a loving adult wants to do, to make it okay for the child. But not everybody reacts that way. So he is left after she goes out selling clothes. She's also going to get some necessities such as nappies. And she says to him she's going to be relatively quick doing that. And she takes a little bit more time than is expected. So Ferreira starts to get really annoyed. She's not back. Where is she? Why isn't she doing her job? Because let's put this into the context. We're talking about a man who certainly believes that it is her job to look after the baby. But let's say that that's the case. Let's just put that psychologically into a position where you don't want to take care of your baby. You are not somebody who has that paternal feeling towards the child. You're annoyed with the child. There are so many millions of things you can do that make you a bad parent, but that mean essentially that you're not going to cause direct harm of your own hands to that child, such as getting up and leaving. Now, that's a terrible thing to do. You are neglecting your child. You are leaving them in an unsafe situation. But like I said, you can just exit. You don't need to get angry with the child. You can't handle it, move on. So he starts to get more and more annoyed that he's just been left there to care for this infant who is now crying like an infant does, because the child's going to be hungry, or maybe they're going to need a diaper change, but he just can't stand it. He starts to get more and more angry, and he escalates that anger more and more and more. Because of course, this is somebody who's got some kind of really malevolent intent for this child. Bear in mind, he's only been left with this child for this period of time by himself. So we can say, oh, he's going to suggest it was his anger that motivated his actions, or we can say this is the only time period he's had to actually harm the child. What kind of intent has he been harboring within his mindset that now he has an option to actually carry out because the mother in the case is no longer present in the home? At 37 years of age, he's become a father. And yet, as opposed to protecting this child, he tells the authorities that what actually happened is she's crying, and he's had enough about her crying. And he wants to, quote, give her something to cry about. Literally. He feels so angry that apparently he now wants to give her something physical that she's actually going to have a reason for crying, because he can't understand why she might need something from him. Now, before I go on to go into the details of what happened, just be aware that in South Africa, physical and sexual assault is more common than in the UK, more common than in the States. In fact, severe child abuse has been increasing in South Africa, and it's something that a lot of charities really want to challenge. And of course, people who come from South Africa and watch my channel, I know you are as horrified as I am, but there are lots of questions about the father's role in particular, and at times some links towards misogyny, a belief that women are lesser beings and should do more menial tasks, which is considered, for example, looking after children, and that those actual mindsets are additionalizing violence towards children. Now, when Ferreira has been left alone with this child and decided he wants to hurt this child so she's got something to actually cry about, what he actually did was horrific. There wasn't just physical violence, there was sexual violence, and that involved rape. Just allow that to sink in. We're talking about a child who's a week old. Now, I am sadly somebody who is very aware of what happens to children. We don't like to believe it. We don't like to see it because it breaks our hearts to know that there are these monsters out there. But let me tell you, there are kids and young people who are sex trafficked, who are impregnated. Then when the baby is born, that baby is taken and that baby is raped and killed literally on video. The umbilical cord is still attached. That's a horrible thing to share with you, but this is not something that is a one-off. This happens. There is a market for it because this kind of depravity exists in the minds of monsters. And they exist in our communities, and it's harrowing. Now, understandably, the mother is out during this period of time. She doesn't know what's happening, and she's unaware what he's done. She comes back, and he keeps her away from the child for a period of time. And actually, he knows that the child is very, very unwell, and he doesn't want her to be aware of exactly what's played out. But understandably, after a period of time, she notices that her child is really unwell, and then she responds by actually going and seeing a neighbour, showing her neighbour the state of the child. The neighbour calls the police and the ambulance. Now, of course, the only person that has been present in this situation is Ferreira. So according to documents from the Pretoria High Court, Ferreira does confess that firstly, he did intend to harm the child. So his statement reportedly included remarks suggesting, as I've noted, that he wanted to give the baby something to cry about. And then he actually recounts the gruesome incident. And guys, it is just breathtakingly horrendous. He said, "I grabbed the baby hard, and in the process, I pushed her head against the surface on which I was working. He then violently raped her a 1-week-old newborn because he became more frustrated by her cries. And this monstrous POS, this horrifically twisted paedophile, said that his main intention after doing that was to hide his daughter once the mother returned because he knew that the baby was in dire need. He did concede that his actions were cruel and gruesome, especially because the child was so young. And obviously, it means there's no doubt whatsoever there was a premeditation of his act, because with respect, he had an opportunity not to do what he did, and he attacked the child and then went on to rape the child. There were lots of opportunities for him to stop. Now, like I said, imagine being that parent who returns, seeing that there is something odd about your child. And as I've said, he said, I kept the baby away from her until later that day. I did this because I realized the baby was seriously injured. Now, the baby's utterly heartbroken mother, Ferreira's former girlfriend, she was living with him in the back room of one of the railway houses in Welverniend. And when she discovered finally that her daughter was so unwell, like I said, she goes and shows another woman in the main house of the property, and they can see straight away this child has been horrendously injured. As I've noted, they call the ambulance and the police, and then the paramedics, horrified by what they find, they transport the baby to Carltonville Hospital. But the injuries were far too grave. I mean, the child had been battered and raped. You can imagine the external and internal injuries that I'm describing there. And she died the following morning. Now, Ferreira did admit that he took methamphetamine, but he also said it didn't sway his judgment. Now, we can all agree that methamphetamine can make people very volatile, but the idea that somebody who was high on drugs would beat their baby and then rape their baby to death just makes no logical sense whatsoever. Lots of people take drugs, they don't act in this way. And also, I take umbrage with the fact that he's suggesting that he understands his actions, but he was just really angry with the baby. That does not make you rape a baby. What makes you rape a baby is you have a malevolent brain that has paedophilia at its core. And the worst type, because there is no good that will come from any type of child molestation, but there is no possibility on the whole that a baby is going to even survive if somebody inflicts that kind of harm upon them. So we're talking about somebody who murdered a baby to death by violently assaulting them sexually in this way. And that comes from something twisted and deeply broken within that human being. Now, when it comes down to the charges, from what I've been able to find out, Hugo Ferreira has been charged with murder of a minor. That can often result as a really severe sentence, like a life imprisonment without parole type of sentence. Also, he's been charged with rape of a minor under the age of 16. And in this case, guys, under the age of 1 week old. So that is literally classified as the most egregious form of sexual offence. Also, assault. Now, that would usually be subsumed under the murder and rape charges because obviously the outcome's been fatal. So he might not get charged specifically with assault. But with respect, the chances are that he's not going to be ever free because the crimes are so egregious and so grotesque and so diabolical that the actual outcry in the community, I think, would be really challenging to manage. I genuinely think vigilantes would be waiting for him immediately. Now, understandably, the moment that the paramedics saw the child and the child was admitted to hospital and then died, it didn't take them long to arrest him. He was arrested shortly after the crime was discovered. And understandably, he hasn't got bail, which makes sense because the state will absolutely argue vehemently against granting bail in cases involving violence against children, especially in a homicide context. He did get escalated to appear at Pretoria High Court because it's obvious it's such a serious offence. So high courts in South Africa handled the more severe criminal matters, including murder. From what I can understand, Ferreira has pled guilty. Now, in some instances, a guilty plea is about a plea agreement. So basically they want to get a lesser sentence, but I don't believe for a minute that's going to be possible. I feel that the nature of this crime is so heinous, his guilty plea is not going to give him any license or leverage. I think he's going to spend the rest of his natural life in prison. I hope he does. I can't imagine for 1 second that any judge is going to allow a sentence lesser than life in prison without parole. I might be wrong, and I will certainly put it in the comments below when I actually find out. Now, one of the things that I've actually been able to find out is at this moment in time, Ferreira has not been deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. So that suggests that there was an awareness of his wrongdoing, and certainly his confession of the crime seems to evidence that as well. And when it comes down to rape and murder, especially when the victims are minor, like I've said in South Africa, from my understanding, it means that he will not be walking the streets again. You know, the appalling nature of this offence, it means that the prosecution is going to ask for the most maximum sentence possible. And like I said, that should be life in prison without the possibility of parole. That said, it could be that he does get an opportunity of parole after 25 years. That does happen in South Africa's legal context. Personally, I have a whole range of suggestions for his sentence. I'm not sure that deep frying an adult human is something that people are going to run with, however. But I do happen to believe that it would be 100% appropriate and applicable in this circumstance. Please, if you have any of your own ideas, add in the comments below. Now, one of the things that I came across in my research is that South Africa really is grappling with a really high rate of violent crime, particularly sexual offences, and there's just elevated instances at the moment of domestic violence, of gender-based violence, of child abuse. There are a lot of charities just screaming about this and saying, now we are getting thousands of reported cases of child abuse, child rape, other forms of violence against minors. And the belief is that these are really underreported, even though there's a huge escalation, because there is such a stigma, also because of a lack of access to resources, and also, let's remember, a fear of retaliation that victims often feel. I will follow this case. I will go into more detail when I have more details about it, but I hope to God that no one would ever consider this kind of individual safe to walk the streets again. The murder was so aggravating. The fact that there's premeditation, the fact that there's a vulnerability of this child, the age of this child, the very fact that he could have just walked out. The child couldn't have followed him. It was a baby and he chose not to. This child was merely 1 week old. The violence was horrific and fatal. There's no mitigating factors that could substantially reduce Ferreira's sentence or responsibility. Even if mental health played into it, let's be clear, they'd have to reach a really high threshold for the courts to consider, and being high on the influence of drugs isn't going to work because you had a choice doing that. I hope to God the judiciary imposes the maximum penalty. Like I said, I don't think deep frying is legal, but I'm just throwing it in there as a suggestion. I also think that we have to remember the mother in this case, because understandably, she went out believing that her child was safe, but she also went out knowing that he was a drug user. And even though she was out there trying to earn money, get supplies for the baby, and she certainly is not involved in the crime itself, you have to ask yourself, were there red flags in this man's behaviour? I cannot believe that he wasn't a violent individual before this moment. I just feel that maybe she should have foreseen there was a potential with this character. But like I said, the crime ultimately, responsibility-wise, lies with Ferreira. He's the perpetrator, full stop. And I wanted to just have this conversation with you because I want to know your thoughts on it. Can you believe that this happens to babies? Can you believe that this kind of familial abuse plays out in homes? Can you, for 1 second, wrap your head around a man who was so violent, so gratuitous, so sexually violating of a 1 week old baby? How can you ever punish that? What can ever fit the kind of sentence that's required to make good on what he did to actually level the playing field? Blows my mind. It really does. Anyway, like I said, I've jumped on to do this because I wanted to know people's thoughts. It's horrifying to imagine that children lose their lives at the hand of their parents, but to lose your life at less than a week old at the hands of your parent, who's a father you should have been able to trust, the fact that you were battered and raped to death, it's not just heartbreaking. It makes me feel a rage within, a rage that's so deep that I genuinely wouldn't care if somebody told me that he'd been microwaved or liquidized. I'm sorry I've had to bring this case, guys, but it's just been laying heavy on my mind and I just wanted to cover it. I will cover it more in detail when I follow the actual court case itself. I really want to know your thoughts. I'm heartbroken knowing this happens to children in our world, and I'm heartbroken that human beings who are predators of this level are born into this world. They don't deserve life. Not as far as I'm concerned. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as ever, look after yourselves, guys. Be safe.